Year: 1893. World's Columbian Exposition. The enormous White City was completely demolished just a few years later. In the summer of 1893, a city stood on the edge of Lake Michigan that did not resemble a fairground, nor a temporary installation, nor anything provisional in character. It rose in white, not as scattered pavilions, but as a coherent urban form. Palaces stretched along broad axes. Colonnades framed open water. Domes reflected light across canals that curved with deliberate symmetry. From a distance, it looked less like an exhibition and more like a capital, carefully composed and already complete. Visitors arriving by rail or boat did not encounter tents or wooden stalls. They stepped into plazas, scaled for crowds, into courtyards proportioned like civic centers, into an environment that communicated order, stability, and confidence without explanation. The architecture did not advertise impermanence. Its language was classical, measured, and calm. Columns stood in repetition. Facades aligned. The city felt as though it had always been there, even though it had not. What made this impression difficult to reconcile was not merely the beauty of the White City, but its scale. This was not a single monumental building erected for spectacle. It was dozens of large structures arranged as a system, connected by water, walkways, and sightlines. It had infrastructure, it had lighting, it had transportation. It absorbed millions of visitors and continued to function day after day with the composure of a working city. And yet, from the moment it opened, its disappearance was already scheduled. The White City was constructed in a remarkably short period of time, assembled through coordination that rivaled the organization of permanent capitals. The speed alone was notable, but speed is not what lingers in memory. What lingers is the contradiction. A place designed to feel enduring, created with care for proportion and continuity, was never intended to remain. Within a few years, it would be dismantled, burned, or left to decay, its presence reduced to photographs and recollection. This contradiction does not announce itself loudly. There are no warning signs embedded in the architecture. The visitor walking through the court of honor would not intuit transience. The materials might have been lighter than stone, but the experience was not. The environment communicated permanence through form, not substance. It trained the eye to expect longevity, then quietly withdrew. Cities are rarely built without an implied future. Even temporary settlements carry markers of improvisation. The White City did not. It presented itself as complete, resolved, and authoritative. Its geometry suggested planning beyond spectacle. Its scale suggested ambition beyond celebration. And its disappearance, when it came, did not follow naturally from its appearance. This is where the imbalance begins. A city emerges with the visual and spatial logic of permanence, functions at full capacity, imprints itself on those who walk its streets, and then vanishes almost entirely from the physical world. Not abandoned, not slowly eroded, actively removed. The question that remains is not whether the White City was temporary by decree. That fact is recorded. The question is why something that looked and behaved so convincingly like a city was designed to be erased so thoroughly, leaving behind influence, memory, and silence where streets and facades once stood. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the United States was engaged in a sustained effort to define itself as an industrial and cultural power. Rapid expansion, technological innovation, and economic growth had reshaped the nation's cities, and international exhibitions became a means of displaying that transformation to both domestic and foreign audiences. World's fairs were not merely celebrations. They were statements of capability, order, and future direction. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was conceived within this context. Its stated purpose was to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, but its practical aim extended beyond historical remembrance. The exposition was intended to present the United States as a modern nation, capable of organizing, constructing, and operating projects of unprecedented scale. Industry, science, art, and architecture were to be placed within a single, controlled environment that visitors could experience as a unified whole. Chicago was selected as the host city after a competitive process that reflected its rising national prominence. Though still relatively young compared to older eastern cities, Chicago had established itself as a hub of transportation, manufacturing, and commerce. Hosting the exposition was both an opportunity and a test. It required the city to demonstrate not only ambition, but competence, coordination, and reliability. Planning for the exposition involved extensive organization. Committees were formed, architects and engineers were appointed. The site was chosen and reshaped. What emerged was not a random collection of exhibition halls, but a carefully planned ensemble. The White City, as it would later be called, was designed to impose visual and spatial coherence. Buildings followed classical forms. Layouts emphasized symmetry. Waterways were integrated as organizing elements rather than decorative afterthoughts. The official record describes the White City as a city of exhibition buildings, intentionally constructed with temporary materials to reduce cost and allow for removal after the fair concluded. Staff, guides, and publications emphasized its provisional nature. Visitors were reminded that what they were seeing was a moment, not a settlement. The exposition was framed as an event rather than an urban proposal. Construction timelines are well documented. The buildings rose quickly through standardized methods and industrial coordination. Innovations in lighting, particularly the extensive use of electric illumination, were highlighted as symbols of progress. Transportation systems moved visitors efficiently across the grounds. Maintenance crews ensured cleanliness and order. In operation, the White City performed as intended, hosting millions over the course of the exposition without structural failure or systemic breakdown. When the fair closed, the narrative followed an expected path. The exposition had succeeded, its goals had been met. The buildings, having served their purpose, were no longer needed. Decisions were made to dismantle or abandon them. Some structures were repurposed briefly. Others were destroyed by fire or removed to clear the site for future development. Historical accounts treat this outcome as natural. Temporary buildings were removed because they were temporary. The fair existed to inspire, not to endure. Its influence would be carried forward through ideas rather than through preserved structures. The White City thus entered history as a moment of convergence, a demonstration of what could be achieved under concentrated effort, and a catalyst for future architectural and urban movements. Within this official framework, there is little tension. The exposition is described as successful, coherent, and finite. The rise and fall of the White City are presented as two phases of a single, well-managed process. What the record does not dwell on is how closely the experience of the place resembled that of a functioning city, nor how unusual it was for such an environment to be so thoroughly removed. The historical narrative remains consistent and complete in its own terms. The exposition happened, it achieved its aims, and it ended. What lies beyond that sequence is not addressed, because within the official account, there is nothing left to explain. When the White City is examined not as an event but as a physical undertaking, the first tension emerges from its sheer size. The exposition grounds covered hundreds of acres, reshaped into a coherent urban composition rather than a collection of independent structures. This was not a fair squeezed into leftover land. It was a purpose-built district, cleared, graded, and organized with the precision normally reserved for permanent civic projects. The number of major buildings alone challenges the idea of a temporary installation. Palaces dedicated to agriculture, manufacturing, transportation, fine arts, electricity, and administration stood at a scale comparable to national institutions. These were not narrow halls designed to be walked through quickly. They were vast interiors with long spans, high ceilings, and axial planning that guided movement deliberately. Their dimensions were closer to those of museums, ministries, or parliamentary buildings than to pavilions erected for short-term display. In the context of American cities of the same period, the contrast becomes sharper. Many state capitals and municipal centers were smaller in both footprint and architectural ambition than the White City. Chicago itself, beyond the exposition grounds, was still developing its permanent civic architecture. Yet, within the fair, an entire district appeared whose visual authority rivaled older European capitals. The imbalance is not one of taste, but of investment. Time, labor, materials, and coordination were concentrated into a space that, by design, would not be allowed to remain. When compared to enduring works in Europe, the contrast shifts, but does not disappear. European capitals invested in monumental architecture as a declaration of continuity. Palaces and public buildings were constructed to last generations, their scale justified by permanence. The White City adopted similar proportions and compositional strategies without claiming a future. It borrowed the language of longevity while disclaiming the intent to endure. This borrowing creates friction, architecture communicates expectations, large axial plans suggest governance, repetition of classical orders suggests institutional authority, broad plazas, framed by symmetrical facades, suggest public life unfolding over time. These cues are not neutral. They train the visitor to read the environment as stable, settled, and meant to be returned to. Yet in this case, the cues pointed toward a future that would never arrive. The investment required to achieve this effect was substantial. Even if the materials were lighter, the organizational burden remained heavy. Infrastructure had to be laid, utilities had to function reliably, movement of people had to be anticipated and controlled. The site had to operate not for a single day, but for an entire season under constant use. Such effort exceeds what is strictly necessary to stage a spectacle. It approaches what is required to build a city. This is where the fracture widens. Temporary projects typically minimize permanence to reduce cost and complexity. They simplify forms, limit scale, and accept visible compromise. The White City did the opposite. It maximized coherence. It expanded scale. It concealed compromise beneath an appearance of order. The result was an environment that demanded to be read as complete. The question that follows does not accuse or resolve. It simply lingers. If the intent was always to dismantle the White City, why invest so heavily in a scale and organization that mirrored permanent urban form? Why concentrate such effort into a structure of time rather than place? The record answers that it was done to inspire, to impress, to demonstrate capacity. But inspiration alone does not require a city-sized framework. Impression does not demand the simulation of permanence. The fracture lies not in the fact that the White City was temporary, but in the fact that it was temporary in declaration while permanent in scale. The architecture of the White City deepens this tension by the way it manages perception. Formally, the buildings followed a shared vocabulary rooted in neoclassical design. Columns rose in regular intervals, entablatures traced continuous lines across facades. Domes anchored sightlines. Axes aligned buildings with water and open space, creating long views that reinforced order and hierarchy. These were not decorative gestures applied at random. They were compositional decisions that shaped how the city was experienced. Neoclassical architecture carries with it an inherited sense of authority. It references traditions associated with governance, law, and civic identity. Its proportions are measured, its symmetry reassuring. When used for permanent institutions, it signals continuity and stability. In the White City, this language was applied uniformly, not to a single ceremonial building, but to an entire district. The result was an environment that felt cohesive and resolved. Visitors moved through spaces that behaved like civic rooms rather than exhibition halls. Courtyards opened into plazas. Walkways framed processions of movement. Buildings related to one another across water and land, maintaining proportional dialogue. Nothing appeared improvised. Even the repetition of white surfaces contributed to the impression of unity, suppressing individual distinction in favor of collective order. This is where the difference between temporary architecture and architectural staging becomes apparent. Temporary structures often reveal their provisional nature through exposed frameworks, modular repetition, or visual lightness. They prioritize assembly and disassembly over experiential depth. The White City did not. Its surfaces concealed structure. Its forms suggested mass. Its spaces encouraged lingering rather than passage. The sensation produced was one of calm authority. Despite the crowds, the city did not feel chaotic. Scale absorbed movement. Symmetry disciplined attention. The architecture communicated that this was a place designed to hold people, not merely to display objects to them. It functioned as a setting for collective experience rather than a backdrop for consumption. Material reality complicates this reading. Beneath the classical skin, much of the construction relied on lighter frameworks and surface treatments. The buildings were not stone in the traditional sense. They were engineered for speed and economy, yet this knowledge does not register immediately in experience. Perception precedes analysis. What the visitor encounters first is not material truth, but spatial intention. This gap between construction method and architectural effect is central. The White City was temporary by structure, but permanent by sensation. It did not ask to be understood as an experiment. It asked to be inhabited as a city, even if only briefly. The success of this request is evident in the way it lingered in memory long after its physical removal. The difference between architecture meant to impress and architecture meant to endure is often subtle. Enduring architecture expects return. It accumulates meaning over time. The White City, paradoxically, achieved a similar effect without time. It condensed the feeling of permanence into a single season, compressing what is usually built slowly into an accelerated form. No judgment is required to recognize this distinction. The architecture did what it was designed to do. It created an experience that exceeded its lifespan. The question is not whether it was temporary, in fact, but whether its form was compatible with that temporariness. In standing within the White City, visitors did not feel as though they were passing through something disposable. They felt as though they were inside a place that had already decided what it was. And when such a place disappears, the absence it leaves behind is not easily reconciled with the explanation that it was never meant to last. At a technical level, the White City was never intended to deceive. Its construction methods were openly described as efficient, economical, and suited to a limited lifespan. Beneath the classical facades lay structural frames designed for speed of assembly rather than centuries of endurance. Steel, iron, and timber carried loads. Exterior surfaces were often composed of staff, a composite material molded to resemble stone when viewed from a distance. The distinction between appearance and substance was known, documented, and, in principle, uncontroversial. And yet, the clarity of this distinction dissolves when considered from the perspective of experience rather than engineering. Structure determines stability. Material determines longevity. But perception determines meaning. To walk through the White City was not to feel surrounded by lightweight assemblies awaiting removal. It was to feel enclosed by mass, rhythm, and proportion arranged with the confidence of permanent institutions. Compared to true stone architecture, the materials of the White City lacked density and durability. Stone carries time within it. Its weathering marks years. Concrete, though newer, promises similar endurance through compression and mass. The White City's materials did not aspire to this kind of permanence. They were chosen to be shaped, coated, and dismantled. Yet they were deployed in a way that borrowed the visual authority of materials they did not possess. This borrowing is not unusual in architecture. Many buildings throughout history have used surface treatments to elevate perception beyond structural reality. What distinguishes the White City is the scale at which this strategy was applied. Entire districts were rendered in the language of stone without being stone. The result was a collective illusion, sustained not by trickery but by consistency. Every building spoke the same architectural dialect. No element contradicted the message of solidity. From a distance, the city read as monolithic. From within, it read as composed. Only upon close inspection did the knowledge of temporariness emerge, and even then, it required explanation. The material truth was secondary to spatial effect. This inversion matters. Temporary structures usually announce their limits. They signal contingency. The White City muted those signals. The paradox lies here. Temporariness was embedded in the structure, but permanence was embedded in the form. One addressed cost and logistics. The other addressed the human response to space. Both succeeded in their respective domains, but they pointed in different directions. The city was engineered to vanish, yet designed to feel settled. This duality complicates the simple explanation that the White City was only a temporary fairground. The materials justify removal, the experience resists it. Architecture, in this case, did not align with lifespan. It aligned with impression, and impression, once formed, is not easily undone by technical footnotes. The White City demonstrated that permanence is not solely a function of material endurance. It can be simulated, condensed, and communicated through form alone. This realization does not imply deception. It reveals capacity. The ability to produce a sense of civic stability without committing to its maintenance suggests a mastery of architectural language that exceeds mere exhibition design. Thus, the question that emerges is not whether the White City was temporary in construction. It was. The question is what kind of temporariness it embodied. Temporary as an object, or temporary as a decision. The materials answered the first. The experience complicated the second. If the White City had been only a visual composition, its removal might be easier to reconcile. But it was not merely a backdrop for viewing. It operated. From the moment the exposition opened, The city performed the functions expected of an urban environment, not intermittently, but continuously and at scale. Electric lighting transformed night into extension rather than interruption. Buildings glowed evenly, streets remained navigable after sunset, and public spaces retained clarity long after daylight faded. This was not symbolic illumination. It was infrastructure, distributed across the grounds with reliability sufficient to support constant movement. For many visitors, it was their first sustained experience of a city illuminated by electricity as a system rather than a novelty. Transportation within the White City was equally deliberate. Walkways were designed to manage flow. Canals carried both aesthetic and logistical purpose. Elevated lines and internal transit systems reduced congestion and structured circulation. Movement was anticipated, guided, and absorbed without collapse. Crowds numbering in the millions passed through the city over the course of the exposition, and the city held. Water systems supplied fountains, maintained sanitation, and supported daily operation. Waste was managed, surfaces were cleaned, order was preserved not by improvisation, but by planning. These are not the characteristics of a stage set. They are the characteristics of a functioning municipality. Administration further reinforces this point. The White City required governance. Schedules were enforced. Maintenance crews operated continuously. Security coordinated across districts. Emergency protocols existed. The city did not rely on spectacle to distract from dysfunction. It relied on systems to prevent it. The scale of operation matters as much as the fact of operation. Small installations can be managed informally. Large ones cannot. The White City absorbed stress, volume, and complexity in a way that mirrored established cities. It did so without extended acclimation, indicating that its systems were not experimental but confidently deployed. This operational completeness blurs the boundary between exhibition and urbanism. A fair can display artifacts. A city must sustain life, movement, and order. The White City did the latter, even if only for a season. It functioned as an environment rather than as a sequence of displays. That millions experienced it as such is evident in contemporary descriptions. Visitors did not describe chaos or fragility. They described coherence. They described calm. They described a place that felt organized beyond necessity. The city worked not just well enough, but convincingly. Here, the contradiction sharpens. A city that operates this completely accumulates expectations. It invites comparison with places meant to endure. Its disappearance, therefore, does not feel like the closing of an event. It feels like the removal of a place that had already crossed the threshold from demonstration to habitation. The White City did not merely show what the future could look like, it enacted it, briefly, in full scale. And when something that functions as a city is dismantled, the question is no longer limited to why it was built, but why it was allowed to operate as completely as it did, knowing that its operational success would leave behind a sense of absence once it was gone. The city worked. That fact remains. What followed its removal did not negate that reality. It only framed it as something that happened, then stopped, without fully explaining why such completeness was necessary for something never intended to last. When the world's Columbian Exposition closed its gates, the White City did not fade slowly into disuse. It entered a different phase almost immediately, one defined not by celebration or operation, but by removal. The official explanations were practical and familiar. The buildings were expensive to maintain. The materials, while effective for display, were not intended for long-term exposure. The land was needed for future development. The event had ended, and its infrastructure had served its purpose. These reasons appear sufficient on their own. Temporary structures are, by definition, meant to be taken down. Budgets close, committees dissolve, attention moves elsewhere. Yet the manner in which the White City was dismantled invites closer attention. Not because it was unusual, but because it was thorough. Some structures were dismantled systematically, their components salvaged or repurposed. Others were abandoned briefly, then destroyed by fire. The grounds were cleared. What remained was leveled. Over time, the spatial logic of the White City was erased to the point that its former presence could no longer be read from the landscape itself. The city did not linger as a partial ruin or an adapted district. It was removed as a whole. This stands in contrast to how other large-scale exhibition sites have been treated historically. In many cases, at least a fragment is retained. A tower, a hall, a pavilion preserved as a marker of what once occurred there. In Europe, Exposition buildings sometimes become museums, government offices, or cultural landmarks. Even when not preserved in full, they often leave behind a trace that anchors memory to place. The White City did not receive this treatment. With limited exceptions, its architecture was not integrated into Chicago's urban fabric. There was no sustained effort recorded to assess which buildings might be retained, adapted, or transformed. The decision appears to have been made quickly and executed efficiently. The city that had been assembled with such coordination was dismantled with similar resolve. Official records frame this outcome as a matter of logistics rather than values. Maintenance costs were cited. The challenges of preserving lightweight materials were noted. The temporary designation of the structures was emphasized. There is no indication of debate about legacy in the documents that survive. The exposition had achieved its goals. Its removal was procedural. Yet removal at this scale carries implications beyond procedure. Dismantling a city-sized environment requires resources, planning, and intention. It is not the passive result of neglect. It is an active choice. The White City did not simply disappear because it could not remain. It disappeared because it was decided that it should not. This distinction matters because the White City had already proven itself capable of functioning as a city. It had managed crowds, infrastructure, and daily operation without collapse. It had demonstrated coherence under stress. In many respects, it had performed beyond what might be expected of a temporary installation. Its continued existence, even in modified form, was not structurally impossible. It was administratively undesirable. Comparisons to enduring architectural projects sharpen this point. Cities invest in permanence when they see value in continuity. They preserve what they wish to remember. They dismantle what they choose to release. The White City fell into the latter category, not because it failed, but because its success did not translate into a claim on the future. The dismantling was not framed as loss, it was framed as closure, and in that framing, the city was allowed to vanish without protest, leaving behind questions not about how it was taken down, but about why such completeness was allowed to exist only briefly, and why its removal was treated as an administrative necessity rather than a cultural decision. The archival footprint of the White City is extensive in some respects and notably thin in others. Photographs survive in abundance, capturing facades, vistas, and crowds. Architectural drawings document elevations, plans, and ornamental details. Written descriptions convey the experience of moving through the city, the impression it made, and the effect it had on visitors. These materials preserve what the White City looked like and how it felt. What they do not preserve is an extended discussion of its potential future. There is no sustained record of long-term preservation planning. No comprehensive analysis weighs the urban value of retaining portions of the city beyond the exposition's lifespan. There are no municipal studies proposing integration of the White City into Chicago's permanent layout. The question of whether the city could, or should, remain does not appear to have been examined in depth within the surviving documentation. This absence is not dramatic. It is procedural. The records simply move on. The exposition concludes. Reports are filed. Financial accounts are closed. Attention shifts to new projects and priorities. The White City recedes into the past without an explicit decision being recorded to evaluate it as an enduring urban asset. Equally absent is a detailed assessment of the White City as a functioning city. While its operation is described in practical terms during the exposition, there is no post-event analysis that treats it as an urban experiment. Its systems are not evaluated for reuse. Its spatial organization is not compared to existing city plans. The experience it generated is acknowledged, but not translated into policy or planning proposals. What remains, instead, is representation without integration. Images circulate. Drawings are reproduced. Architects and planners reference the White City as an influence. The City Beautiful movement draws inspiration from its order and clarity. Its ideas travel, even as its physical form does not. The city becomes a reference rather than a place. The lack of integrated mapping reinforces this condition. There is no enduring plan that situates the White City within Chicago's evolving geography as more than a historical overlay. Once dismantled, it becomes spatially unanchored. Memory replaces ground. Influence replaces continuity. This gap does not imply concealment. It reflects a hierarchy of concern. The White City was designed to demonstrate capacity, not to propose permanence. Once that demonstration was complete, the the apparatus that supported it was no longer needed. The record follows that logic faithfully. Yet, the absence itself becomes meaningful when placed alongside the completeness of what once existed. A city that was planned, built, and operated with such precision leaves behind more than images when it disappears. It leaves behind a question of evaluation. What criteria determine whether a place is worth keeping? At what point does demonstration become claim? The records do not address this question directly. They do not argue against preservation. They simply do not consider it at length. The White City passes from physical reality into historical reference without a documented moment of transition. What survives, then, is an outline without an endpoint. The images show what stood, the drawings show how it was conceived, the descriptions show how it was experienced. What is missing is a deliberation about why such a place, having achieved coherence and functionality, was allowed to exist only as a moment. The archive tells us how the White City was built and how it was removed. It does not tell us why its disappearance required so little explanation. The way history is commonly told determines not only what is remembered, but what is rarely questioned. In the American context, historical narrative has long been organized around forward motion. Progress, innovation, expansion, and industrial growth form a continuous arc in which each stage exists primarily to justify the next. Cities rise, technologies advance, and older forms give way to newer ones in a sequence that emphasizes becoming rather than remaining. Within such a framework, the White City fits comfortably as a moment. It is remembered as an event, a spectacle, a demonstration. Its value lies in what it represented at the time and in what followed afterward. It is treated as a stage set for the emergence of modern American ambition, not as a place that might have claimed continuity on its own terms. This framing subtly shapes the kinds of questions that feel natural to ask. When a structure is defined as temporary, inquiry tends to focus on how effectively it fulfilled its immediate role, not on what was lost when it was removed. When a city is understood as a symbol rather than a settlement, its disappearance is interpreted as completion rather than erasure. The narrative of progress reinforces this tendency. In a story oriented toward the future, dismantling becomes a sign of confidence rather than uncertainty. The ability to build quickly and then remove without hesitation signals control. What matters is not what was taken down, but what came next. Chicago's later growth, its skyscrapers, its infrastructure, and its industrial dominance absorb attention, leaving little space to dwell on an urban form that does not fit neatly into the lineage of what followed. As a result, the White City is often discussed in terms of influence rather than presence. Its architectural language is traced forward into planning movements, civic ideals, and aesthetic norms. It becomes an origin point rather than a subject in itself. The city is remembered for what it inspired, not for what it was capable of sustaining. This approach discourages a different line of inquiry. Questions about why a fully functioning urban environment was dismantled so completely, or why its preservation was not meaningfully debated, appear secondary, even unnecessary. They do not advance the story of progress. They introduce friction into a narrative that prefers momentum. There is also an implicit hierarchy of seriousness at work. Permanent infrastructure is treated as worthy of deep historical analysis. Temporary installations are often grouped with entertainment, display, and celebration. The White City, despite its scale and complexity, is placed in the latter category. Once categorized this way, its disappearance becomes expected rather than remarkable. Over time, this expectation hardens into assumption. The absence of the White City from the physical landscape reinforces the idea that it was never meant to stay. And because it is assumed to have been temporary, its removal is rarely revisited as a decision with alternatives. The question of whether it could have been retained, adapted, or transformed fades from view. In this sense, the rarity of the question is not accidental. It is produced by the way historical attention is allocated. The future-facing narrative leaves little room for sustained examination of what was deliberately dismantled, especially when that dismantling does not align with themes of decline or failure. The White City does not fit the category of ruin. It also does not fit the category of continuity. It occupies a space that historical storytelling is not well equipped to dwell in. Today, the White City is no longer present in physical form. Its buildings do not rise from the ground. Its canals do not reflect light. Its plazas do not gather crowds. The site it once occupied has been absorbed into the ordinary geography of the city, its contours reshaped by time, use, and development. Nothing in the landscape announces that a city once stood there in full operation, complete and coherent, if only briefly. What remains are representations. Photographs capture facades that appear solid and monumental. Drawings preserve symmetry and proportion. Written accounts describe movement, atmosphere, and scale. Together, these fragments allow the White City to be reconstructed in the imagination, but not revisited as a place. Memory replaces presence. Despite this absence, the influence of the White City persists. Its architectural language helped shape civic ideals across the United States. Its emphasis on order, clarity, and monumental form informed city planning, public buildings, and urban aspirations for decades. In this sense, the city did not vanish entirely. It dispersed. Yet dispersion is not the same as survival. Influence can travel without carrying the conditions that produced it. The White City is remembered as a source, but not as a system that once functioned in its own right. The distinction matters because it determines whether the city is understood as an experiment concluded or as a possibility set aside. The ground where the White City stood offers no direct answer. It does not argue for preservation, nor does it confirm inevitability. It simply exists, layered with subsequent uses that have overwritten what came before. The silence of the site mirrors the silence of the record on certain questions. The city was built quickly, operated successfully, and removed decisively. These facts are well established. What remains unresolved is how they are interpreted together. Was the White City always only a spectacle, or did it briefly demonstrate a form of urban coherence that did not align with the trajectory chosen afterward? Was its dismantling merely practical, or did it reflect a deeper preference for movement over continuity? There is no need to resolve these questions here. The White City does not demand a verdict. It stands, in memory, as a complete environment that once existed and was then allowed to disappear without leaving a structural trace. Its absence is total enough to discourage inquiry, yet its influence is strong enough to suggest that something of significance passed through history and did not remain. What lingers, then, is not an answer, but a perspective. The White City can be remembered as a fair that ended on schedule. It can also be remembered as a city that functioned briefly and was never truly considered for preservation as such. Between these two views lies a space that historical narrative rarely occupies. The question is not whether the White City should have survived. The question is whether it was ever examined as something that could.